Okay, so I had a student ask me how to create a kaleidoscope in After Effects. So this idea intrigued me, so after I figured out a pretty interesting way to do it, I thought I'd share it with you all. So first thing we're going to do is create a main composition. So to do this, I'm just going to use standard HD, so 1920 by 1080. I'm going to call this comp main. So main comp. Nothing else special there, and then we're going to create another composition. So this composition we're going to call kaleidoscope. And for the width and height, we're actually going to make a perfectly square composition. I think it will be easier to deal with our kaleidoscope in this way. So depending on how much you would like to zoom in and out, you should scale this up quite a bit. So I'm going to use 2K. You might consider using a 4K composition. So let's do 248. So standard 2K by 248. Make sure you unlock your aspect ratio for this. And I'm using just standard 30 frames a second for this, and the duration that 300 is fine, so click OK. Alright, so how this is going to work, we're actually going to have another composition in a second, so I need to actually find some image to import. So I'm going to go to my texture library and we'll just pick some image just so we can see what's going on. This is kind of a weird one, this weird glass, so we'll use this texture here, import that, and let's drag it down into your kaleidoscope composition. Then I'm going to right click and do pre-compose, or you can just do Control-Shift-C, and we're just going to call this image. This is going to open up another composition if we double click, and this is going to just be our image. But for this, we also want this to be square. So right click over the image name and then change our composition. I'm going to do 2048 by 2048 again. Okay, so this means I'm going to have to scale up this weird glass, but that's alright. There's also another interesting effect called the reptile, something like that. There we go. And this allows you to expand your image. So don't forget about this effect. It's pretty useful. So we could say, alright, expand this, and actually let's do 1,000 pixels, 1,000 pixels, and 1,000 pixels on all of these axes. 1,000. And for the tiling, let's do unfold. We'll kind of make it look seamless. It will still get mirrored edges, but that will be pretty interesting. Okay, so like those cheap kaleidoscopes you can get, it's like a tube. At the end of the tube there's usually some beads or something, and then in the tube there's several mirrors, and it's just the object at the end is being reflected in all the mirrors, and that's why you get that kind of cool effect. So we need to create an adjustment layer, and an adjustment layer is useful because it's going to affect everything beneath it. And we're going to click enter and then type in mirror 1. And mirror 1 is going to have a mirror effect on it. Okay, so on our mirror effect, nothing seems to happen until I start changing the reflection angle. Then we can see that, it is reflecting around this point right here. But I want to move this point to the center. And in order to do that properly, we just need to divide this first number up here by 2. So it's going to be 1024. So it'll take it right to the center. Alright, so that's fine for this one, and then Control D. And the rule of thumb here is we need to divide our mirrors by 360 and try to get like an even number. And you don't have to do it like that, but that is a good rule of thumb. So on this first one, let's do 60, and then we'll increment by 60. So let's do 120 for the next one, Control D again, and then do 180 for this one, and then we'll do 240, and then we'll do 300, and if you do another one for 360, you're just coming right back to where you were before at one full rotation, so that doesn't really make sense to do. So we can have 6 mirrors and that will be fine. And then we get kind of this kind of a, when we zoom in, we see 3 different sides that are all the same. Okay, so that's the basic premise of this effect. And then how this really works is you take your image, you click R, and then you can rotate that, and that's where you get the cool looking, cool effect. Okay, but there's quite a bit more that we can do before we really start playing around with the image to enhance what we've got here. Okay, so let's create a null object, a new null object, and we're going to call this our kaleidoscope control. And we're going to add a slider control effect to this. And for the first one, we're going to click the Enter key and then just type in image rotation. And then we're going to add another one, and we're going to call this one, I should put this up above, and I'll call this mirror rotation. So we might want to be able to control how our mirrors rotate and control how our image rotates. And of course we can do that here, but since we want to also control the mirrors, or we might want to do that, And we also might want to use other effects driven by the rotation. Like, for example, you could have a hue and saturation effect that was linked up here that changed the hue as it rotated, which might be interesting. So to do this, what we're going to do for the first thing is we want to select all of the mirrors, not the image, just the mirrors. Click the E key to bring up the effect, and we're going to open up this mirror effect on all of them. And then on our kaleidoscope control, we're going to open up our E again, and then open up our image rotation and our mirror rotation. And what we want to do first for our mirror rotation is we want to attach all of our reflection angles to this slider. So that allows us to rotate all of our mirrors together, which might give us some interesting animation or allow us to change what image appears on the first frame, for instance. So what we want to do is hold down the Alt key and then click on where it says reflection angle. And notice how this goes red, and this is creating an expression for us. So we grab the pick whip and attach that to our mirror rotation slider. And before we click enter, what we need to do is maintain the current degree that this reflection is offset by. So we want to actually add that degree back onto this expression. Then click the numpad enter key. So notice when we go up into our kaleidoscope control, we can open up our sliders here if we can actually see this. When I move this number, you look down here, this one is always 300 more than this one. So it's always going to be rotating by 13 plus 300, okay? All right, so let's do this on all the other ones as well. So reflection angle, I'm going to grab this one up here, and then we're going to add 240 to this one. Add 180 to this one. 120 to this one. Okay, and then for the last one, it's just 0, so we're still going to attach it, but we're just not going to add any numbers at the end, because adding 0 to that wouldn't really make any sense. So now what this allows us to do is control our mirror rotation. Now everything rotates evenly, but it allows us to find a particular angle to start on. So we don't need that right now. And our image rotation is what we're going to do next. This will allow us to control this image rotation down here. So hold down, click the R key to bring up your rotation. If it's not already up, R. Hold down Alt on the rotation stopwatch, grab the pick whip and attach it to image rotation, then click enter. So now we can close this. And what this allows us to do is then just have this kaleidoscope open. We could lock all these layers, it doesn't matter, or we could just shy them if you wanted to click the little shy button, just hide them away. It doesn't really matter, just to organize your scene a little bit better. But now we only need this controller, and then we can add our image rotation here on these. So I'm going to add just a really simple expression to this image rotation slider by holding on the Alt on the slider stopwatch and typing in time times 50. So every second this will go about 50 degrees, okay? So that's pretty interesting. And we're getting some pretty colorful images around there. That looks quite cool. Pretty pleased with that one. So let's, I'm going to save this really fast. Call this tutorial number 2 here. Alright, so next step, let's pop over into our main composition and grab our kaleidoscope, our kaleidoscope comp, and then pull it down. Okay, and this is zoomed in, so I need to click the S key and just scale this down just a little bit, so it's like around there, so around 50% would be fine. And now I need to create a new solid. I'm going to call this kaleidoscope matte. And I'm also going to make this one perfectly square. So I'm just going to, our composition is 1080, so I'm going to make my width 1080 as well, and then click OK. And if I toggle my transparency on, you can see that this is just a solid black square, and then I can go up to my ellipse tool up here, which by default, it's going to be on your rectangle tool, so hold it down and then click the ellipse, and then double click the ellipse. And that will make a perfect ellipse mask in that solid. Okay, then on our kaleidoscope, we're going to change our track matte to alpha, and remember, if you don't see your track matte, just click columns, right click over here, columns, and then do switches and modes. That will get rid of your button, or you can just click your button. It doesn't particularly matter. I like mine on the same line though, so that's why I do that. Alright, so now we want to click on our kaleidoscope matte, click the M key to bring up our mask, and open up our full mask controls. And we're going to take our mask expansion and just lower that slightly, okay? Around -40 is probably good. And then I can increase my feathering just around the edges just a little bit. I could do like around 30, and that would look okay as well. Okay, and now what we're going to do is let's pop over back into our image and see if we can create something that's perhaps a little bit more interesting, or just explore other options. Okay, so before we do that, let's lock this composition for the main composition, and then double click on Kaleidoscope. And then click and drag this composition over. And what this allows us to do, it locks our main composition so we can always view it, but it allows us to work in other ones at the same time. So I actually need to be in my image, and I need to be making adjustments here, but I want to be able to see the changes here. So there's all sorts of images you can choose. You can choose anything, like random images, but something with enough contrast is pretty useful. For instance, I could choose something silly like a door, whatever this is. Gate or something. Pull this down in here, and you could animate this. You could animate the position, and you can see the type of effect you're going to get there, which is kind of neat. It's pretty cool effects. Just by actually, this door is a pretty good choice. I kind of like that. That's a pretty interesting shape, so I'm going to leave that in there and just turn it off. But we can also make our own from scratch. So if we go create new solid and just type in fractal, click OK. We can add a fractal effect to this. Or fractal noise is what we want, not the fractal per se. And there's lots of different fractal types. There's all sorts of different things you can choose here. There are different types of fractal noise. I'm just going to stick with turbulent smooth, that's fine. You can also animate the evolution just to add a little bit more animation to this. So you could just alt click on the evolution stopwatch and type in time times like, I don't know, 25, add a little bit of a subtle shift to this as I play. You can see it's slightly moving. You scrub through it, you can see it's really moving. And this is a pretty useful thing to do. But what we want to do now is create an adjustment layer. And I'm going to actually call this vector blur, because vector blur is a pretty interesting effect. Vector blur. So this is really good for doing like energy stuff. So on vector blur, you increase your amount, kind of gives you these little cellular energy looking crystal things. I don't even know what you call that, but it is kind of neat. And if you go to your type, kind of like direction fading, it kind of looks cloudy, and it kind of works well for this. And I can increase my revolutions to add more detail to it. And I can also add, since it is kind of blurry, I'm actually going to add an unsharp mask to this as well. Unsharp mask, and let's do 100%. Add a little bit more definition, especially the main comp. You can probably see that a little bit better. Very slight, but I think will help. Okay, and then we can start adding color to this, and we could do that with adding another texture to control some of the color. So let's see what else we have here. I think this peeling paint one was pretty cool. So let's see what we can do with this one. Slap this in underneath our vector blur, and that looks pretty cool. We can click the S key and just scale this down. And we can actually scale this down quite a bit too. We could just have this in the center if we wanted. We could animate the scale up throughout the animation, which would kind of give us some interesting results. But for now, I'm just going to maximize it here. That'll be fine. And what we want to do, and let's change the blending mode. Let's just cycle through some of these. So you hold down the shift key and then click the plus equals sign or the minus key, and then you just like cycle through some of these and see what happens. And quite often when you're doing kind of weird effects like this, you might end up using a blending mode that you generally don't use. Like for instance, I think the difference one might be kind of cool for this, or classic difference. Yeah, this one was quite colorful. It's kind of cool looking. Kind of like that. Okay. And well, I'm going to actually animate the position of this. So I'm going to click the P key, and I'm going to move this over here, and then I'm going to click the P. I'm going to click the position stopwatch, and then towards the end of this, I'm going to have it move all the way over here. That's going to give us some interesting animation. as we progress through. And then on our vector blur, I think I'm just going to increase that more. Let's double that to like around 80. That's pretty interesting. Gives us pretty interesting swirly motions, which is kind of cool. I like that. Okay, so let's pop back into our main composition. And there's a few things I'd like to do just before we wrap this up. So let's add an adjustment layer, and we're going to call this layer just we could call this color correction, just CC. Just going to add a curves to this just to add some more contrast. Pull down the darks here, and then pull up your highlights. And for this next part, I don't want to add a glow effect to this because I think that's kind of cool. Let's add a glow. Now with a glow, if you don't have if you're not using above 8-bit, you're not really going to see anything. So let's actually use full 32-bit. Just be careful. Click on info and just hover your mouse over these points, these white points. And if you're getting values over 1, you're going to have to use another curve to kind of bring down some of those highlights, or use like an HDR compressor, whatever it's called, like a tone mapper that comes with one of these effects. It's called the HDR highlight compression. It's a pretty good one to tone down some highlights if you realize you're using too many of them. Not really going to add that much here, but we could, if we need that, I'll just leave it there. Okay, and I also want to add just a little bit of blur around the edges here, because real kaleidoscopes, especially cheap ones, is going to look a little bit blurred around the edges. So I'm going to kind of replicate that. And then the last thing we're going to do is some chromatic aberration. So for this, what we're going to do is add another adjustment layer. I'm going to call this edge blur. I'm going to put this beneath the CC. And on the kaleidoscope matte, I'm going to just copy that. So Control D to copy that, and I'm going to pull that above my edge blur. And on the edge blur, I'm going to set the track matte to alpha. And on the kaleidoscope map, I'm going to have to turn this on so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm just temporarily going to add a fill effect to it. It's going to be bright red, but that's all right. With the M key, to bring up your mask controls, we're going to duplicate that mask, Control D, change the second mask to subtract, then we get a fringe. So on the first mask, I need to turn off my mask expansion. And actually, not quite. Let's do like 20 instead of -40. I think that will be alright. And on the second one, we'll actually decrease our expansion considerably and then add more feathering. Maybe something like that. So anywhere where it's red, the blur is going to show up. And we kind of want this to be feathered quite a bit, so something like that would probably look okay. And I can now turn off my fill, and then we're going to add a blur. So I'm just going to add add a camera lens blur, like a Gaussian blur or something. Add that. Just kind of blur that up just a bit. And oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have added that to the matte. I need to add that to the edge blur layer. There we go. If we do that a lot, we can really see how that's blurring the edges around where that matte is. So wherever this shows up, it's going to affect it. So I might actually have more expansion on there, and then turn this off, and we can see that's blurred more around the edges on our edge blur. So toggle that on and off, we can see that. That's pretty extreme. I don't really want anywhere near that. 20 is probably alright. Maybe just 10. Add a little bit of blur around there. I think we can play around with that, but that should give us an interesting result. Okay, for the last thing, save this, and then I'm going to select just the kaleidoscope and the kaleidoscope matte, and then I'm going to do Control-Shift-C, and I'm actually going to call this chromatic aberration, although it's just a combination of the kaleidoscope aberration. So chromatic aberration is that kind of red or red, green, blue shifting that occurs with certain lenses, and it's an overuse effect for sure, but just a slight amount of it is kind of cool, especially with lower end kaleidoscopes. You're probably going to get a little bit of fringing on the sides. So on this one, I'm going to actually rename this now to red, but by creating the composition originally as chromatic aberration, it's going to maintain this in our project rather than just having red, because you might, what's red? Well, now this is chromatic aberration, you'll probably remember. You can also click on where it says layer name and see the original names of these things. Alright, so where it says red, let's add a set channels effect. Pull this over, and we want to strip out everything except the red channel first. So we're going to change the blue and green to off. I'm going to duplicate this, lower it, and I'm going to call this next one green. Turn the red off on this one, and then we're going to do green for the next one. Oh, sorry. Green should be at green, and then we just need to turn off red, and we can see that it's green. Do the next one. This is going to be called blue. Oops, not blur, blue. Turn this one on, and then we can see if we turn this green off and then blue on, we just get one full blue one full green one, and then one that's just red. Okay, so if we select all of these and then add them together, we're going to get our original light back, which is correct. But what we want to do now is select all of these, click the P key, zoom in, and we just want to shift these very slightly. So I'm going to hold down the shift key and then use the right arrow key or left arrow key and just shift these very slightly. So something like that will be fine. Around 2.5 is fine. And then on the blue, I'm just going to shift this backwards the same amount. And it's a very, very subtle effect, but it is kind of interesting, especially if you had a little bit of a higher res shot. But it is kind of interesting. Okay, so we could then go back to your image, make adjustments to that, or keep just playing around with it and add other animations. But overall, that's at least a way I determined to make a pretty interesting kaleidoscope effect in After Effects. So I'll render this out and show you the final result. All right, thanks for watching.